the 70th anniversary of UNHCR Statute, which will be taking place today, tomorrow, Thursday, and then on the 27th is the closing ceremony. I am so glad that you could attend, and we look forward to discussing the 70th anniversary of the statute today. This welcome comes from the University of Essex, from on my part as the chair of the Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network Secretariat, and from UNHCR, and I am happy to introduce Professor Gillian Triggs, who is the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, and she will deliver an opening presentation now.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Gilbert. And it is, of course, a very great pleasure for me to be able to make some opening remarks for this first global public event for the Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network. And this is the first of the sessions, as Professor Gilbert has set out, in a series of webinars, and we welcome to it all of you, particularly exiled and refugee scholars around the world. Thank you to the GAIN Secretariat that is chaired by Professor Gilbert, and to the 11 universities and academic institutions that are hosting this event. As a former legal academic, I, of course, am really thrilled to see this conference take place as part of our celebrations at UNHCR of the 70th anniversary of the statute that established this agency in 1951. In 2018, most nations agreed to the Global Compact on Refugees, a non-legal commitment with two central ideas: solidarity in responding to refugees and to all those displaced or stateless throughout the world, and an equitable sharing of the responsibilities for protecting them from danger and persecution, recognizing that 80% of refugees or displaced people are hosted by poor or developing countries. The aims of the compact were really revolutionary in the sense that it took both the Refugee Convention and the role of UNHCR into the 21st century, because it was a recognition that the agency was now with a mandate beyond that of only the unilateral obligations that states had adopted and accepted under the convention in 1951, but now recognizing this global responsibility for the movement of peoples in need of protection. So it was a leap forward, and the particular aims were to ease pressure on host countries that were assuming such a huge responsibility, to enhance refugee self-reliance in the communities in which they found safety, to expand access to third country and durable solutions, and to support the conditions for returns to the country of origin in safety and in dignity. So those were the objectives. And the compact, as I say, a breakthrough, was followed in December, just over a year ago, by a pledging forum here in Geneva, in which states, civil societies, universities, faith-based groups, scholars, the business community, and importantly, refugees themselves, made about 1,400 pledges to give concrete effect to the compact. And among many practical measures, and there were many, to implement the idea of responsibility sharing, it had to be more than a grand vision, has been the creation of GAIN, the Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network. And the aim of GAIN is to facilitate research, training, and scholarship, solidarity with scholars and students by helping particularly junior colleagues in regions of the world that are less well connected to plug into the global networks and discussions that perhaps some of us take for granted, but that are a critical part of our research and getting a truly global view of some of the issues that are posed by this global movement of peoples. We were also, GAIN was also tasked with creating scholarship opportunities, pathways for people to study in other countries and to share ideas and concerns and research. The other objective of GAIN was to broaden the geographic and thematic scope of the disciplines and of the scholars working on these protection issues. I'm particularly excited by the idea that GAIN is going to bring together people scholars from the global north to the global south, that we haven't had the level of interaction on these questions that we might have. And I think that GAIN is going to provide us the means by which we can provide a genuinely regional and global response to this mounting problem for refugees. Well, the creation of GAIN then does recognise the contribution that scholars have made throughout the history of UNHCR, because they've been able to stand back and to provide evidence, critical analysis, and promotion of refugee law as it's developed over the last now 70 years. So it is time to reflect on UNHCR itself, its role, and of course the evolving jurisprudence emerging through the Refugee Convention, but particularly to understand the profound changes since 1951, when 6 years after the end of the Second World War, the negotiators hoped to find a solution for about 2 million displaced people. Today, UNHCR reported for 2019 that at least 80 million people are asylum seekers and refugees, including about 48 million forcibly displaced within their own country. Sadly, this number continues to climb as we meet at this webinar, and they're doing so with increasing violent conflict, environmental degradation, inequality, poverty, persecution, and discrimination. And added to these root causes of forced displacement is, of course, as you all know, the global pandemic of last year, a health crisis that is continuing into this year with no very clear end in sight. All of these have challenged the contemporary role of UNHCR, of the Refugee Convention, and of the Global Compact, stimulating and exciting as it was with its vision. And I'd suggest that the Compact and refugee law have an enduring relevance. Indeed, that the Compact has been tested and that it's provided a realistic and compelling roadmap to respond to the COVID crisis and to addressing some of the root causes of flight. I will, however, be very keen to read the papers that will emerge from this conference with a scholarly reflection on the challenges that we face in the future. And this conference, this webinar, is looking at some very important questions. What do we mean by protection? It's a big word. It's a word we use all the time in UNHCR, but it means different things to different people. What is a durable and sustainable solution for refugees? And that, after all, is the primary, that's the lodestar of our work here at UNHCR, to find resettlement places, to facilitate voluntary repatriation, or, as we're now discovering, encouraging better levels of inclusion and integration in the societies in which a displaced person has been able to find safety. We're also going to look at the role of technology in learning, but also the role of technology in enabling asylum claims to be made in a time of COVID, when at the height of the pandemic in April last year, 168 countries had denied fully or partially access to asylum. Another question that will be looked at is how we will respond to displacement by climate change, something I think that's going to be even bigger this year in our research and our questions. What are the best ways to support host nations that are bearing such a huge responsibility, and how does a regional and localized approach help? Well, one of the very particular challenges that's of concern to all of us who've ever worked in the academic scholarly environment is the sad fact that about only 3% of refugees are able to attend universities. And as part of UNHCR's recognition of 70 years of protection for the agency, a fund has been started to raise 70 refugee scholarships. Well, I'm really pleased to be able to say that we've already more than met that goal. The private donations, philanthropic groups have now reached, I think, something in the order of 83 or 84 scholarships, and we hope now that we can garner more to really give practical implementation to the idea of scholars working together to bring some measured evidence-based research and analysis to help deal with this unprecedented problem of the movements of peoples. I just wanted very briefly, because it's in the spirit of the game, to mention some of the wonderful speakers that we have and we'll be hearing from. Mr. Abikar, who's a fellow of the British Institute in East Africa. He has a Master of Education through the Borderless Higher Education for Refugees project in Kenya. Awad is with the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies in Cairo to change and to create, shape the game. He is an advocate in particular for the inclusion of refugees in healthcare systems, particularly, as we now know, for the inclusion in vaccine programs. And we have, I think, just in a few minutes, Ms. Hala Taleb, who is a student. She's a member of the Tertiary Refugee Student Network. She's a student of journalism, and she's been working to increase the number of refugees in higher education, meet that, again, ambitious but important objective of raising that number from 3% to 15% of refugees attending university in 2030. And the last person I'd like to mention is Ms. Jessica Lawrence. She is a lawyer for human rights at the University of Johannesburg. She's engaged with many others, of course, litigation before the courts to challenge government laws and policies that are out of kilter with contemporary laws. And so she's working on amicus briefs to help inform some of the judgments that courts are ultimately called upon to make. So this webinar, this session, is going to focus on solutions, and that is something that High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, has stressed over and over again. We're here to find durable solutions for those who've been forcibly displaced. So I very much look forward to reading the papers. I congratulate you on giving some time to this and building a truly global community of scholars to the objectives of the Global Compact on Refugees. Thank you very much. And back to you, Professor Gilbert.
Thank you, Assistant High Commissioner. I am very happy once again to welcome everybody here for this session of the series of webinars that we're holding. I think one of the things that is important to say about this time, as it were, in global history, is that when we first thought about this conference back in 2017, we hoped there might be 100, 150 people in a conference hall somewhere in Geneva. Courtesy of having to work remotely via Zoom has meant that we hope that over the course of the next few weeks, as we host these sessions, there will be hundreds of people able to attend and listen to all the presentations from across the world. We have 11 research institutions or universities hosting these sessions. They are covering every single time zone, and therefore people can all listen, join in, participate to the extent Q&A lets that happen. Okay, and we are reaching much further than we ever could. We are reaching into refugee settlements, which would have been unthinkable back in 2017 when we first put this together. So while COVID-19 has brought so much despair and tragedy to the world, it has meant that responding to the need for this conference has meant we've got a much broader reach than we ever would. When I was asked to become the chair of the Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network, two things were very important to me. The first was the word interdisciplinary. I am a lawyer. I've been a lawyer all my life. And the focus of my work with refugee questions has always been as a lawyer. But This is the interdisciplinary network, and we're trying to ensure that all disciplines come together, because academics have an unhappy tendency to work in silos, to know their own little field and to know the people who interact with that field. What we want with the GAIN is to make it possible for all these really brilliant minds to come together and help achieve the durable and sustainable solutions that the Assistant High Commissioner spoke of. It is, to my mind, one of the biggest changes in my research, that I am currently working with colleagues in the Computer Science Department and UNHCR's Innovation Service, looking at better protection and better solutions, courtesy of satellite imagery. I would never have thought that was a possibility pre-GAIN. GAIN is also trying to bring together academics from all over the world. It is truly global. And this is particularly true for new and emerging academics. The GAIN should, in that regard, assist them with their research and their teaching. I should add as well that the primary sort of thought in my mind when I was asked to be chair was, how can we move away from research on refugees being academics in the global north, using countries of asylum, most of which are low and middle income countries, as case studies for their research projects. That has to stop. We have to try and ensure through GAIN that refugees and other persons of concern to UNHCR are incorporated in the planning and the actual research of research projects, and that we engage with universities and research institutes across the world. And we stop having this global north focus of research on refugees to research about forcibly displaced persons that includes forcibly displaced persons and the countries where they are primarily hosted. I will now happy to introduce our three speakers for this afternoon's session. But before I do, I have some technical information. Normally at this point, I'd be telling you where the restrooms are and what to do in case of a fire alarm going off. Zoom means that those issues are not important, but as you will see, it's already in the chat function. Interpretation is available in English, Spanish, and Arabic. So please select your preferred language. And interpretation is also available in International Sign Language. I can actually see the signer next to me at the minute, so hopefully that is working perfectly. Secondly, if you encounter any technical problems in connecting to this Zoom webinar, it is being live streamed on YouTube through the Human Rights Centre channel at this very moment. That uses less bandwidth, but does not allow for the same interactivity, unfortunately. But it will mean that you can listen and view much better if your internet connection does not manage to handle Zoom properly. To connect with it, just follow the link that is in the chat. Thank you. So let me now turn to our three distinguished speakers who are, and I will turn off my video while I do that. So the first speaker is Professor Agnes Vadai, who is a Member of Parliament and Chair of the Committee to Promote Respect for International Humanitarian Law at the International Parliamentary Union. She's a Hungarian politician and international relations scholar. She is the chair of the Committee to Promote Respect for International Humanitarian Law, as I have said, and a member of the high-level advisory group on countering terrorism and violent extremism. She's been a member of the National Assembly of Hungary since 2002, and she's vice chair of the Defence and Law Enforcement Committee since 2018. In 1999, she became a graduate student at the Utrecht University, earning a doctorate in law in 2003. In 2007, Dr. Vadai became an honorary professor of Miklos Zrínyi National Defence University and became vice chair of the subcommittee on technological trends and security at the NATO National Parliamentary Assembly in 2020. And my apologies for the very poor pronunciation of Hungarian words. I knew Utrecht before. But Professor Beth Ferris, Elizabeth Ferris, known as Beth far and wide, is research professor with the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and an adjunct professor in the Georgetown Law School. From January to September 2016, she served as senior advisor to the UN General Assembly's Summit for Refugees and Migrants in New York. She presently serves as an expert advisor to the UNSG's high-level panel on internal displacement. From 2006 to 2015, she was a senior fellow and co-director of the Brookings LSE project on internal displacement, where she worked to support understanding and protection of internally displaced persons. Prior to joining Brookings, she spent 20 years working in the field of humanitarian assistance, most recently in Geneva at the World Council of Churches. She also served as the director of the Church World Services Immigration and Refugee Program as research director for the Life and Peace Institute in Uppsala and as a Fulbright professor at the Universidad Autónoma de México. Her teaching experience has included positions at Lafayette College, Miami University, and Pembroke State University. She has written extensively on refugee, migration, and humanitarian issues, and many of her books are on my shelves in my office, including The Politics of Protection, The Limits of Humanitarian Action, published by Brookings Institution Press in 2011, and The Consequences of Chaos, Syria's Humanitarian Crisis and the Failure to Protect, with Kamal Khashoggi of the Brookings Institution Press in 2016. Her latest book, Refugees, Migration and Global Governance, Negotiating the Global Compacts with Catherine Donato, was published by Routledge in 2019. Ms. Hala Taleb is student leader of the Tertiary Refugee Student Network, TRSN. Hala is a senior journalism student who was a victim of the Syrian war that forced internal displacement on her and her family until she managed to move to the United Arab Emirates in 2015. She chose journalism as a major because she believes that more light should be shed on the refugee situation in local and global media. Her urge to advocate for refugees intensified through her internship with UNHCR Abu Dhabi, where she found out about the severity of the refugee crisis in the UAE during the COVID-19 pandemic. Hala wants to help other refugees to survive and overcome all the obstacles. So, turning to Professor Beth Ferris. Beth, it's about the broader mandate of UNHCR. Persons or groups of persons who've been forced or obliged to flee or to leave their home or to avoid the effects of armed conflict, violence, violations of human rights or natural or human-made disasters, and who've not crossed a border, make up the majority, more than 48 million, of the world's displaced people, according to UNHCR. In recognition of their needs, the guiding principles on internal displacement were developed 20 years ago. How has the approach to IDPs changed since the guiding principles?
Well, thank you, Geoff, and it's wonderful to be with you and to have an opportunity to wish happy birthday to UNHCR on its 70th birthday. You're absolutely right in pointing to the existence of internally displaced persons as a major challenge for UNHCR and indeed for all humanitarian and development actors. As you point out, the number of IDPs is more than half the number, more than twice the number of refugees, and yet sometimes they don't receive the attention they deserve. The development of the guiding principles back in 1998 really marked a landmark. Sometimes I think of it as an untold human rights success story to get this group of people firmly on the international agenda. The guiding principles themselves have proven to be very useful. I think of the brilliance of those who developed them back in those days, people like Francis Dang and Walter Kalin, who had the foresight to see that instead of proposing a new binding international convention, to build these principles on a set of existing international law. As such, they've proven to be very, very useful to governments, civil society activists, IDPs themselves, academics, and so on. But back then, if you go back 20 years, the real focus was on humanitarian response. The guiding principles talk about the importance of solutions. They say displacement should last no longer than is necessary. But in terms of a lot of practical guidance and in terms of an impetus of political will to come up with solutions for IDPs, perhaps we would say more about it today if we were drafting the guiding principles right now. The reality is that much internal displacement, like many refugee situations, have become protracted. We need the engagement of development actors to find solutions for IDPs. We need to pay much more attention to host communities and to developing approaches that meet the needs of both those who are displaced and those who are in communities that receive them, and to think about the consequences for communities back home. Since then, we've had a number of other developments. We have the IASC framework on durable solutions, which emphasizes that finding solutions to internal displacement, perhaps unlike that for refugees, is very much a process rather than a certain endpoint. A lot of organizations from GIPS to developing, which has developed indicators, to the International Organization for Migration, which has worked on the progressive realization of solutions. We have a lot of concrete tools for helping us to think of ways to resolve it. But, fundamentally, it's really a question of engaging all of government, particularly those who are concerned about long-term development of the country. It isn't just a humanitarian issue. We need to rethink that internal displacement is a development, not just a humanitarian issue, and requires the engagement of a different set of actors. Finding solutions for IDPs is key to stability in the country, to resolving conflict, and to coming up with, a robust, prosperous, stable, good governance system. On the humanitarian side, we have the cluster system, which came into being in 2005, which started out, and sometimes people forget this, but it started out as a way of addressing the gaps in international institutional response to IDPs. But since then, it's kind of become a general coordinating body for humanitarian response writ large. I think UNHCR has done a lot on IDPs in terms of assessing its own actions and looking for ways that it can become more engaged. I do think we need to think further about how the institutional architecture is structured around meeting the needs of IDPs, and particularly for finding solutions. And finally, the biggest gap with the guiding principles, which is also true for the 1951 Refugee Convention and actually most laws in the world, is the big gap between the normative framework, which spells out rights and obligations very clearly, and what happens on the ground. The work of translating these guiding principles or these normative frameworks into actions that really impact on the lives of those who are displaced is a big one. And I hope in the future we devote more energy to that. So thanks, and thanks for raising the issue of IDPs as the number one question.
I turn now to Ms. Hala Taleb. Hala, you've experienced firsthand internal displacement and are living outside your country of origin due to conflict. Okay. Nearly 10 million youth were internally displaced in 2019, according to the International displacement monitoring centre, and a significant additional number were refugees or seeking asylum. What are some of the considerations that should be made around solutions for youth?
Mr. Geoff? Thank you so much for the introduction. And from my point of view, one of the solutions that should be taken care of while thinking of displaced and refugee youth is accessing education or the workforce. However, there are many considerations that should be made around this solution. One of these considerations is the lack of identifying documents for a big number of refugees. The documents needed to enter schools and universities usually get lost when a person flees. Some refugees and displaced people were destroyed. Others had to leave their country and enter another country illegally and face problems of attaining a residence visa, for example, in their host countries, which stopped them from being able to get access to education or any other services. I know some students who were actually studying in higher education in their home countries, but they couldn't prove that with education due to the many complexities. So they lost their education opportunity. Therefore, this lack of documentation is a big consideration when thinking of such solution. Another consideration that should be made is to internet and electronic devices needed for connecting the refugees with learning and working opportunities. Most of camps are not provided by internet, which became a key factor in accessing education in all its forms and levels, especially after COVID-19. Thus, we need to take into consideration either having offline solutions or influence the decision-making regarding providing these camps with the means they need for such solutions. Also, language can be a consideration too, and there is a need for more free language programs that would help refugees to merge more in their hosting countries and enable and other services. Finally, one of the considerations we face usually is the lack of opportunities and scholarships that result from all of this. There are limited numbers of scholarship opportunities that are given for refugees in some areas. Let's take me as an example. I came to UAE in 2015 and I could graduate from high school with a percentage of 98% in 2017. But still, it was very hard for me to find a scholarship, especially that I'm not an official refugee in the country because the UAE did not sign the Article 1D of the 1951 Convention. So therefore, I'm only a refugee in the UNHCR, and I couldn't find many opportunities for me, and especially I couldn't afford but a full scholarship due to many financial crisis that I used to face because of us starting from the zero in this country. So therefore, later on, I could find the full scholarship, which was for media, my passion, luckily, and I could get a financial grant from UNHCR to access dorms. But this was only because I had very good grades, but we should take into consideration that other refugee students also get good grades that qualify them for higher education, who don't get the opportunities and scholarship they need. These students should have the right to higher education regardless of their excellence. And these are some of the considerations that I think that we should take into consideration.
Thank you, Hala. Professor Vadai, Agnes. The 1950 statute refers to refugees. As Beth has already mentioned, the mandate is now being extended to include IDPs as well. But equally, UNHCR's mandate extends to stateless persons. A critical development in the last 7 decades was the 1961 Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness. Today, at least 10 million people around the world are not recognised as nationals of any country, and a further 230 million children are unregistered, according to UNHCR. Without nationality, these displaced people, and sometimes not displaced, just not having a nationality in the country of their birth, are often denied key elements of solutions like attending education, opening bank accounts, and accessing medical services. Could you please illustrate the contribution by parliaments to ending statelessness?
Thank you very much, Professor Gilbert. And let me say it's an honor for me to speak here today at the opening ceremony of this very important series of seminars. For many of us, having a nationality is just, it's just natural, it's given, it's an obvious fact of life, a right taken for granted. And to be honest, there is no reason why in today's world anyone should be deprived of or live without a nationality. We all know that there are a lot of laws and international conventions today that relate to the question of citizenship, starting with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that states that everyone has the right to a nationality and that no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality nor denied the right to change his nationality. There are conventions related to statelessness and its reduction, and more recently let me refer to the SDGs, and in particular SDG 16, which focuses on legal identity for all. So we all know that there is a solution that exists to your question, and that is in the hands of the states. So in the hands of governments and of course in the hands of parliaments. So that's why we believe that parliaments, and particularly Inter-Parliamentary Union, have a very important role in ending statelessness. We know that the solution resides in building a legal framework that prevents and prohibits statelessness. And this means actually addressing discrimination in laws, and in particular gender-based discrimination. Members of Parliament have the responsibility to raise this question in their own parliaments and of course review laws and if it's necessary amend them. Actually, we have seen very good solutions and results when female parliamentarians, regardless their party affiliation, formed groups and they started this amendment. We also know that any law is as good as the efforts and resources put into them. So here again, we have the members of parliament who of course have a very important role by asking questions to their governments and of course asking questions during the budgetary process, during the budgetary debate in the parliament to find the necessary budget allocated for those who are really in need, for those who are the most vulnerable, that is to say, for example, in this case, stateless people. And of course, it's very important that these laws are widely known by the society and understood. So here again, members of parliament who meet with their voters regularly in their constituencies talk about these laws and talk about the importance of these laws to people of their own country, so they understand why parliaments should introduce such laws and why parliaments should allocate budgetary funds to solve these problems. What the Inter-Parliamentary Union believes is that we should focus on these questions. In our committee, in the International Humanitarian Law Committee, we have been sensitizing members of parliament to humanitarian and human rights law questions, and in recent years, of course, to the question of statelessness as well. And here it's very important that members of parliament have information, that they can act, and that they also have the tools and they have access to the best practices. That's why it's very important to form and to put together these tools for parliamentarians. And let me show you a booklet. I don't know whether you can see it. This is one very important handbook for parliamentarians from the Inter-Parliamentarian Union and from UNHCR. It's a result of a work together of the two organizations, and this is dealing with the good practices in nationality laws for the prevention and reduction of statelessness. Now we are working on disseminating this information. It collects really the best practices, how we can solve the problems. And we also, in our committee and in IPU, try to assist members of parliament to gather as much information as possible. We also continue awareness raising efforts globally. Like in February, we are going to have a seminar together with UNHCR, and we are also doing targeted assistance to different regions and, of course, to countries. So we have seen the laws changed and amended, wrongs turned into rights. Of course, we can certainly do much more, and that IPU and our committee is going to continue this effort. It's very important that we also engage specific groups such as young parliamentarians, women parliamentarians, as well as we target specific geographic regions to help, to amend those laws, to get rid of those discrimination, especially the gender-based discrimination. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm actually going to come straight back to you, Agnes, because I think one of the things that you are also expert on is that women are disproportionately impacted by the results of war and conflict and make up the majority of displaced people. Given your work on the Women, Peace and Security agenda, could you please reflect on critical elements of conflict prevention, conflict management and peace building that will help make long-term solutions like voluntary return a reality for more forcibly displaced persons?
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, if there is no conflict, then you don't need to talk about conflict prevention, conflict management. So it would be so easy, you can say. It's just a question of political will. But of course, we see that the political reality is different. IPU's and my approach is that the respect of inclusiveness and political dialogue must be essential to all sustainable peace and solutions for those who are most affected by wars and conflicts. Well, if we remember 20 years ago, United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 laid the groundwork for international and national frameworks that fully recognize that crisis and conflict affect women and girls in particular ways. This resolution calls for very active participation of women across the board to enhance global security, peace and stability. IPU, Inter-Parliamentary Union, has placed great focus on advancing implementation of this resolution and also to related resolutions on women, peace and security through the work of parliaments. Several IPU resolutions were adopted in recent years, providing policy guidance for members and of parliament, of course, for parliaments as a whole. And in 2015, the IPU Forum of Women Parliamentarians called on parliaments to promote the adoption of national action plans on the resolution and to increase the participation and leadership of women in parliaments and enhance partnership between women and men MPs, particularly in work related to peace and security. We also, in the IPU, called to ensure that 15% of peace and security funding is dedicated to gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, including the support to women's political participation and the elimination of all forms of discrimination and violence against women and girls. Well, to date, only 86 countries, at least I can say 86 countries, have adopted a national action plan that is source dates of August of 2020. What we see as for women leadership, well, it's quite limited. Women hold 1 in 4 parliamentary seats worldwide, but they only chair 1 in 5 parliamentary chambers and 1 in 10 defense committee. Even in Hungary, well, I can be the vice chair of the defense committee, but I can't recall during my political career any woman chairing this committee, although I was chairing the National Security Committee, which was quite unique, and I used to be the Deputy Defense Minister, but still there are a long way to go to increase this participation. As for conflict prevention, management, and peace building for parliaments, it's very important that women also hold key positions and participate in the decision-making process. It is also very important that there is a very strong partnership with society, civil society, because it can bring in different ideas, especially with the situation of women and girls. And it would be really nice and good if parliaments, and there we need a political will, could ensure that women play a central role in peace building. Well, I have seen in many conflict areas, when there were female soldiers sent, they also have this kind of peace building. So when I was Deputy Defense Minister, what I was trying to push forward, and of course our government was open to that together with the Parliament, is to have more women in the military, so that when there's a conflict situation and you need peace building or conflict management, more women could participate and they can, help to solve the problems of local women and local girls. So it's very, very important to increase the participation of women in political life in general, so there would be more women in solving the problems that occur, and maybe there would be less will to start the problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Beth, I had the privilege of attending the formal consultations on the Global Compact on Refugees. It's envisaged that the GCR has moved the mandate on to actually what it was doing anyway, but it's now official in a document from the General Assembly. So we're now looking not just at protection in terms of refugees arriving in a country, but at the protracted displacement over many years. And that means that we have to think not just about protection on arrival, but protection throughout that displacement, which basically requires development actors alongside the humanitarian actors. So I was hoping that, given your recent meetings with policymakers, academics, practitioners, refugees themselves on the GCR, what are the critical factors for sustainable solutions to protracted and large-scale displacement?
Thanks, Geoff. And you're absolutely right. A lot of the motivation for the GCR was particularly to address this protracted displacement and come up with solutions. We have the CRRF, the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, which intends to bring together all stakeholders, both national and international, to come up with solutions. What I think we need, though, is to use some of the mechanisms and to be creative in the way we use some of the suggestions that are spelled out in the GCR. Complementary pathways, for example, could open the door to different kinds of resettlement, to using labor mobility schemes, educational opportunities, as ways to help refugees, and I should say IDPs, move out of this protracted situation. I also want to pick up on something Hala talked about, and that's the importance of education and to using the resources that refugees and IDPs themselves bring. It's a really positive trend, I think, to see more and more emphasis on refugee-led organizations, to work with refugees themselves to see what kind of solutions might be possible in very different contexts. I'm a big fan of the new community of practice that's developing around refugee self-reliance, led by Refuge Point and the Women's Refugee Commission, that really changes the discourse from how do we care for, maintain, assist refugees, to how do we support their own self-reliance efforts. I think we need to be more creative in looking at the way different kinds of programs are structured to work with refugees to ensure protection, to be sure, but also to open the door to new solutions and to new ways of conceptualizing solutions. But fundamentally, when you're talking about conflict-induced displacement, we can come up with lots of answers and ways of finding solutions for refugees. But fundamentally, it's a political question. The I would say the failure of the UN Security Council to stop conflicts or resolve conflicts in places like Yemen and Myanmar and South Sudan and a dozen others are really behind a lot of the protractedness of displacement. So devoting more efforts to peacemaking and to consolidating peace and to really working to eliminate the drivers of displacement, I think is absolutely essential. That doesn't normally fall in the bailiwick of humanitarian or to some extent even development actors. But I think we need to make sure that our programs are in fact addressing the causes that are responsible for protracted displacement. Thanks.
Thank you. Hala, can I address a question to you? I have worked with UNHCR on research projects, and whenever I've been in the field talking to either refugees or IDPs, the children have always said that the one thing that they wanted was education. We met with them in schools or even at the weekends in the youth groups, and they all wanted education. You work with the Tertiary Refugee Student Network that advocates for long-term solutions for refugees through greater access to higher education and encouraging refugee self-reliance. The model specifically focuses on connecting refugee learners and alumni at local, national and global level. What are your lessons learned from working with TRSN on key factors for sustainable solutions?
So, in the TRSN, we work together as refugees, youth, and learners to develop our communities and learn from each other's regional experiences and problems that we all internationally share as refugees. We learned that we have many common issues regarding the access to education in all its forms due to the consideration I stated before. And the TRSN is led by refugees who got access to tertiary education like me by being offered scholarship like the DAFI, Albert Einstein German Academic Refugee Initiative. And therefore, we wanted to share our experiences and what we learn from each other with the refugee students we share similar background with, regionally and internationally. Also, we voice out what we learned from our communities in international conferences to advocate for the right of education for refugees. And from what we learned, we managed to make some initiatives that would help refugees to tackle some of the considerations and problems I addressed before. TRSN members have volunteered time and skills to help their peers get ready for higher education and get relevant work and study-related skills. For example, in Rwanda, TRSN member Jackson has started Origo program initiative. Origo program provide programming skills training to refugee youth who are passionate about IT. Currently, 20 students are learning different programming languages such as HTML, CSS, JavaScript, databases, and many others. In Chad, TRSN members Bello and Fedai are supporting fellow refugee youth through English classes. In addition, we also managed to be the voice of all refugees learners for the CLSC, Connected Learning in Crisis Consortium, which is an innovative form of higher education sponsored by the UNHCR that uses information technology to combine face-to-face and online learning. It engages students in ways that allow them to link personal interest, peer relationships, and opportunities. By expanding such initiatives and programs, we are trying to contribute to the goal of the UNHCR to enable 15% of refugee students to access higher education by 2030. What I personally learned from becoming part of the TRSN is that as a refugee who got a chance and opportunities to get access to higher education, I am obligated to offer the same hand that was offered to me to the people that were in my place. We can make a change when we get united as refugees and help each other to reach our best potential. We try to find solutions as refugees for refugees to enhance our resilience and build inclusive communities and reach our best potential.
Thank you. And I apologize, there was a slight technical delay in transferring back to Zoom at that moment from me, especially considering we only have 5 minutes left for this presentation. So what I would like to do is ask the three panelists in no more than 60 seconds to summarize what they want the audience to take away from this afternoon's session. So turning first to you, Professor Vadai. Agnes, what would you say in 60 seconds?
So thank you very much. Unfortunately, the time is never enough to speak and to answer all the questions. There were very important questions I would like to answer. First of all, yes, you're right. Stateless people are not stateless people. They are just people like anybody else on this earth. They have name, they have dreams, they have family, and they want to live just like anybody else. We politicians are responsible to solve this problem, and I hope the United Nations End Statelessness campaign, I Belong campaign, is going to get a step forward, and that we finally be able to end statelessness on Earth. Politicians can do a lot by promoting, the idea I was talking about, that refugees, people who have no nationality, they're just like us, just like any voter in Hungary. And there were questions about the Hungarian refugee treatment. Here, I'm from the opposition, so I don't want to comment on the government's ideas. I'd rather say in the IPU, in the IHR committee, we believe that people are equal, and that our job and my members of parliament's job is to find a solution for these problems. Thank you very much.
Beth, can I turn to you to quickly summarize what you think we should take away from today's meeting?
Yeah, I would use my last 60 seconds to really talk about climate change and the intersection between climate change and conflict. This is going to be the new normal, folks. Right now, most of the world's countries that experience internal displacement caused by conflict also have displacement caused by disasters. We need to get much better at analyzing this intersection, at responding to it, at preparing for it, and to the extent possible to preventing large-scale displacement that comes from the intersection of climate change, environmental factors, and conflict. Thanks.
And Hala, can I ask you what you would like us to take away?
Yeah, I would just want to say that we need to focus on education and our solutions for many reasons, because first of all, education will actually provide the refugees with better access to employment in the future and stable income. As they say, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetimes. So education will make these refugees more independent and don't rely on just financial aid. Also, aside from the financial aid, a refugee has the right to choose the path and the specialization they need. They don't need to work only for survival. As what Noam Chomsky says, a fundamental element of the human nature is the need for creative work, for creative inquiry, for free creation without the arbitrary limiting effect of coercive institutions. And I believe that everyone has this right to education, either it's a refugee or any other person, regardless of their background. Also, tertiary education will enable these refugees in the future to go back to their home countries and do some change and actually rebuild their home countries. They will have the knowledge that will make them create some conflict resolutions. They will make them more open-minded because they were get to know many different backgrounds through their tertiary education that is outside of their communities or their camps. So therefore, education is very crucial for me, eventually in solving the problems of refugee crisis from its roots and lead a change in this area. And thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you to all our panelists, Professor Ferris, Professor Vadai, and Hala Taleb. I'd also like to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon, and I hope you found it useful and interesting. I especially want to thank the interpreters who have worked so hard, and the team at Essex and within UNHCR who've made it all possible. I just had to stand here and talk. That's the easy bit. There's been an awful lot of work going on in the background. Throughout my time as an academic, 40 years, I've worked with refugees, either in the field or actually at Essex. We've had several come through and study. We've made scholarships available through the Global Refugee Forum's pledging process. They are the most dedicated students you could ever imagine. And I only hope that, as everybody has been indicating in the discussions this afternoon, we make it possible for refugees and other persons of concern to UNHCR, IDPs and stateless persons, to find a solution for themselves in the future. Hoping that you can attend some of the other sessions on Tuesday, tomorrow that is, Thursday, and the 27th. Thank you for attending. Goodbye for now.